Hello all, welcome to Lit Guide. We'll be learning the chapter I Stand With You Against the Disorder, written by Jeannette Armstrong, who is a Native American writer belonging to the Okanagan community. It was originally an article published in Yes magazine. I shall begin by looking into some of the relevant biographical details of the author and her intention behind writing this article. I shall then talk a little bit about what Native American reservations are and what their history tells us so that you would be able to understand and appreciate the chapter better. The text itself is about the Okanagan community to which the author Jeannette Armstrong belongs, the geography of the place, their beliefs, teachings, etc. Jeannette Armstrong is a Native American writer, indigenous civil rights activist, a sculptor, and an educationist. She was born in 1948 on the Okanagan Reserve in British Columbia, which is a province in Canada. You should understand that a reservation is a piece of land set aside for native population. Historically, reservations were introduced by European settlers to confine Native Americans to a particular region so that they could have the desirable regions to settle down themselves. So, from the time of European colonization, the white settlers often fought with Native Americans for land and natural resources. After many conflicts, the government took measures to remove Native Americans, often forcefully, from their original ancestral land and relocate them to other areas, which later came to be known as reservations. So, historically, such reservations were a cunning way of keeping Native Americans away from the land that white Americans wished to settle down in. We have already seen about such things in the chapter Chief Seattle's speech from Zeitgeist. There, I had explained in detail about reservations when I talked about the background of the speech. Now that you have a basic understanding of what Native Indian reservations are, let us see further details about the author. Jeannette Armstrong, who is a Native American herself, always stood up for her own people, and she tried to educate others on the true nature of the Aboriginal people. She is the first Native woman novelist. Through her works, she aims to create a sense of pride among the Native Indians and to change the wrong and often negative image associated with them. She believes that, as a writer, she must uphold her community. She is a professor of Indigenous Studies and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Philosophy. She works to empower the Okanagan community to which she belongs. Her first work is a poem on John F. Kennedy. Her first novel is Slash. This is the first novel by a Native woman. Her second novel is Whispering in Shadows. She published an anthology of poems titled Breath Tracks in the year 1991. She published a collection of short stories titled All My Relations, an anthology of contemporary Canadian Native fiction. She has also authored a couple of children's books. Let us now see more about the chapter. We have already discussed that it was originally an article published in Yes magazine. In this article, Armstrong shows the true nature, beliefs, traditions, and culture of the Okanagan community. She shows the threats the Okanagans face due to globalization, privatization of land, exploitation of resources, and westernization of undeveloped cultures as a cunning way to exploit them. Through these threats, Okanagans are forced to lose touch with their own culture. They are forced to become cheap labor force and they end up losing or dispossessing their ancestral land and resources. This is what we call cultural imperialism. So we can say that native population have always been victims of cultural imperialism. Through this article, Armstrong aims to show her support for the Okanagan community and resist the violence of cultural imperialism. Let me give you a simple explanation of the term cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism refers to the act of one culture dominating and exploiting another culture. Here, the dominant culture is the Western culture, and the victim cultures that are exploited are the indigenous cultures. Let us now look at the summary of the text. Jeannette Armstrong begins the article by talking about the geography of the Okanagan Reserve. Okanagan is a part of British Columbia. It is a very dry and hot place. It has two mountain ranges on its sides, flanking it. On one side is the Cascades, and on the other side is the Selkirks. The main river that flows through their land is the River Columbia. Armstrong then talks about her parents and their ancestry. Her mother is a river Indian. That means natives who live in close association with the river. One of the major tributaries of River Columbia that we talked about earlier is the Kettle River. Armstrong's mother belonged to the Kettle River people, and they were in charge of fisheries in the northern parts of River Columbia. Her father, on the other hand, belonged to the mountain people, that is, natives who lived in mountains. They occupied the northern part of British Columbia, known as the Okanagan Valley. Remember, in the opening of the text, we had talked about the geography of Okanagan Valley and that it was flanked by mountain ranges. Her father's people were hunters. She says that her name is passed on from her father's side of the family. She has the name of her great-grandmother. Even though she is associated with her father's side, she has an equal right and responsibility to the river through her mother's side of the family. She says this is who she is. That is, she derives her identity from her culture and her ancestry. She says that it is difficult to translate Okanagan words and thoughts into English. She gives us some examples to show this. In the Okanagan language, when they use the word Okanagan to refer to themselves, its closest equivalent translation in English would be the phrase, "the ones who are dream and land together." This is who they are. It is their original identity. Armstrong says that Okanagan people are living, dreaming earth pieces. She again attempts to translate the meaning of the word Okanagan into English language. Dream is the English word that is the closest equivalent to the word Okanagan in their native Okanagan language. But still, the word dream is not perfect to fully convey the meaning that the word Okanagan holds. Okanagan means the unseen part of our existence as human beings. It can be the mind, the spirit, or the intellect. She explains another meaning associated with the word Okanagan that refers to the unity among the Okanagan people. She explains this concept using the example of several strands of hair or twine bound together. These individual strands of hair or twine become stronger when they are bound together. This is a symbolic way of saying how each member in their community is bound to others and how they together form a strong, unified community. According to Okanagan belief, each individual is made up of 4 main capacities: the physical self, the emotional self, the thinking intellectual self, and the spiritual self. These 4 selves work together to create an individual and join that individual to the rest of the community. Armstrong then proceeds to talk about each of these 4 capacities. First one is the physical self. The physical self refers to the body. Okanagans believe that body is earth itself and that body is sacred. They believe that the body is made from earth and returns back to earth when our life ends. Body is sacred because it is the core of our being, and it is in this body or the physical self that the remaining 3 cells coexist. The literal English translation for the word body is the land dreaming capacity. The second self is the emotional self. It is the capacity of an individual to form a bond with things and people around him or her. The Okanagans use a word to refer to the emotional self that can be translated into English as the heart. The third component is the thinking intellectual self. It refers to the memory or the capacity for analytical thought and storage of information. If we translate the Okanagan word for the thinking intellectual self into English, the closest equivalent phrase would be the spark that ignites. All the other 3 capacities perform their functions as directed by the thinking intellectual self. The Okanagans believe that if this capacity, that is the thinking intellectual self, is not connected to the heart self or the emotional self, it can become a destructive force. It means that logical or analytical thinking without emotion or ethics can lead to disastrous effects. The fourth capacity is the spiritual self. Even though nothing about this capacity is discussed in the chapter, we can understand it from the original text of Armstrong's article. The link to it is given in the description box. I will give you an easy explanation to the concept of the spiritual self. The Okinagans believe that the spiritual self is the hardest to translate. It is the larger self that encompasses everything else. It is larger but more discrete. The other three selves or capacities, that is, the physical self, the emotional self, and the thinking intellectual selves, fuse together to form the spiritual self. It has great power, and the Okinagans refer to it as the living source of our life or existence. Next, Armstrong talks about the concept of family and community and their importance in Okinagan culture. When a person is born into a family, that person automatically becomes part of the community. The ability to bond with others in the community is important. Without that ability, a person is said to be crippled or incapacitated and becomes lifeless. The Okinagans refer to this relationship or bond with others using a word that can be translated into English as our one skin. By this, they mean that the bond between the community and family includes their ancestors as well as the future generations that are yet to be born. They all share one flesh. The most important teaching of the Okinagan community is that community comes first, then comes family, and only then comes the individual. This is because the Okinagans believe that without community and family, a person cannot have a meaningful existence as a human. This is how the chapter concludes. Thank you.